Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to our live stream. So today we have Florian, who will talk to us about Microfrontend with React. So hi Florian, how are you doing?
Great. I hope you're all doing well.
So do you use Microfrontend at your job? Is that something that you do a lot?
Yeah, we are quite into micro frontends, especially based on React. We started doing micro frontend solutions about, let's say, I think 2.5, 3 years ago. And since then, our architecture has been refined. It has been implemented in multiple customers. And about a year ago, we started, let's say, building an open source framework based on the learnings we had implementing that particular architecture and growing it over time. And this talk will be focusing on how we did it, what principles we follow, and why we think this is a good solution that may fit your needs if you want to go into the micro frontend space.
Okay. Well, so I will let you start with the presentation, and afterwards, if people have any question, you can ask on the chat. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. So, I mean, I already gave away our story in a nutshell. So let's get right into the topic. So as I said, we rolled out an open source solution. We call it Pyral. Essentially, we call it also a reference implementation of this kind of architecture for micro frontends. If you're not familiar with micro frontends, I will tell you in a nutshell what they are about. I mean, it's not a completely new trend, but let's say in the past 1.5 years, the term micro frontend became more and more popular. Even though it was already coined, I think 3 or 4 years ago. But now we see microfrontend solutions popping out pretty much everywhere, and many talks, many articles about it. It is about splitting up the monolithic single-page applications or also server-rendered applications into multiple pieces that can be not only developed but also deployed independently. Now, the whole term is, let's say, an umbrella for multiple techniques you can use, depending on what you want to do. Of course, since we are here at ReactConf stream, we are focusing on single-page applications, on highly interactive web apps, and we are focusing on client-side rendering, even though, and that's of course one of the nice things about React, you can also cover server-side rendering too with this approach. Nevertheless, all the demos I have and all the things I show, we will do with client-side rendering. And feel free, of course, to think that a step further. That being said, as already mentioned, the spawn of techniques to achieve microfrontends is pretty much infinite. You can achieve that in many varieties. And while server side, or let's say on a reverse proxy stitched microfrontends do have some appeal, we found our sweet spot on the client side because we target specifically large-scale portal applications. So that means, for instance, a customer that wants to have a portal for different services, let's say a kind of digital service platform, where then users can get all their needs, their digital needs covered from, I don't know, downloading software, managing machines, whatever this company has to offer. And all these different, let's say, services are developed by independent teams. They are rapidly developed. They are maintained independently. They need to be shipped on independent schedules. And for such an application, I mean, why should we only apply a microservice backend technique? Why is the front end still a monolith? So that's why we want to break it up somehow. And in our projects, React was set as a core technology. And if we think about it, React already gives us many things that are very usable for micro frontends. React has a very good component architecture, and components form the basis for anything you want to let's say, share, you want to distribute. And now the only thing that's missing is how can we deploy these components, let's say, independently in such a way that, let's say, a page coming from one micro frontend can still use components created by another micro frontend. And all these, let's say, patterns we brought together in a single architecture. And as a reference implementation, we have Pyral. Now, I don't want to bore you with our site. Please, if you want to get more information about the project, visit it. We also, of course, have a GitHub repository. But I want to sketch the principal idea behind the architecture of Pyral and this kind of microfrontend solution. So in a nutshell, we have a single service added to, let's say, a standard application that brings the abilities of loading microfrontends. And we call this service a feed service. Now, there are different ways how the feed service can be used. So you can use it in server-side rendering and you can preload things, all that. But as we will see in a minute or two, you can, of course, use it directly from your single page application to get some information about the microfrontends that you want to load, where to get them from, and some additional metadata, like, for instance, who's the author of the microfront and what's the version, etc. Now, how that works is in, let's say, a kind of development flow that you start as a so-called application shell, which gives the application already all the surroundings. So it comes with some prerequisites like React, for instance. And this application shell will also usually contain some kind of a layout. You don't need to have this layout, but maybe it makes sense for some design consistency to come with a basic layout, let's say a header, footer, maybe a kind of navigation placeholder. And this kind of layout we usually call then Pyral instance. So Pyral is the framework, and if you have an application using Pyral, that's an instance of it. Now, if you now want to develop a single micro frontend that we call in this framework here Pilot, you use your already existing application shell, the Pyral instance, as a kind of emulator. You can think about it as, you know, if you want to develop an app for the iOS, you will also have an iOS emulator underneath. So that will give you the ability to run it locally before you deploy it via the App Store. Now, your App Store in that analogy would be this feed service. To see how that, let's say, happens in a real world application, let's just look at one of our demonstration portals, which we set up. So this is a standard React application. I can just load it. You've seen maybe a few loading spinners here and there. We are now on a dashboard-like view. And you can also, of course, go on different pages. Here, for instance, let's go on the vacation page. There was also, for a brief moment, a loading spinner. So all these things are lazy loaded, only on demand. And I can just navigate like in any single page application. Now, the question is, how did this view come together? And if we take a look at the console, and I hope you can see the screen well, when we load the application, of course, some requests are being fired, but there is one particular request that is interesting. And this is a request going to feed.pyral.io. Now, you can, of course, write your own feed service. We got a free feed service out there at feed.pyral.io, and that was the one I used now to get these microfrontends, the so-called pilots, in there. It's a standard GET request, and in the end, I get back a standard JSON response that contains now 3 elements. And these are 3 microfrontends. So one is called posts, another one is called timesheet, and the third one is called vacation. And the beautiful thing is that we see already here on the dashboard 2 of these 3 microfrontends reflected. One of these tiles coming from the vacation, one of these tiles coming from the timesheet. Now there's another one above here. So same principle. It always loads the information in a lazy way. And hopefully, I think this should go against the JSON placeholder API. If this API is broken, of course, we will not see anything. But a point being taken, we are now on a dedicated page called sample that's coming from a dedicated microfrontend. Now we can, of course, talk a lot about how now independent teams can ship code and, independently create a large-scale solution. But one of the other benefits, of course, of this kind of architecture is that in the feed service, you can now activate some kind of personalization. So you can, for instance, have feature flags and rules. For this portal, I've, for instance, implemented a very simple rule. If we send the save data header, we don't want to see this post microfrontend, so the sample will vanish. Let's just try that out. So I will now click on the save data on, reload this thing, and you'll see the sample link is gone. And even one step more, if I go to the sample website now, it's, there is no page, right? It's not rolled out for this user because I sent the header. So that's the only difference. We can check that out, that in our request, we now have the save data on. And likewise, of course, if the save data would be deactivated, suddenly the page is back again. And maybe this time we get the data from the JSON placeholder or not. But the page is back again, it's functional, and the difference is, of course, that we sent the header not with the save data on, but we didn't send it at all. So this is another, let's say, benefit. Of course, there can be, let's say, multiple benefits of why you want to apply microfrontends in the first place. For us, it was partially, of course, because it supports large-scale teams, and we have clients in that space. But mostly because you can achieve an additional level of personalization without interfering with any kind of code, because at the end, even a product owner can now set the rules for when different microfrontends should be delivered or not. So if you have very well-defined domain boundaries between the functionalities delivered by these microfrontends, then it also makes sense from a personalization point of view. So there is, for instance, no need to embed any administrative actions in all your code. You just separate it out in a particular microfrontend, and that only gets delivered if the user has also the permission to do these actions on the backend. And that way you only deliver the code that really can be executed, which is quite nice from a bundling perspective too, right? So no need to make any if statements or whatever, and then you bundle it in or not, whatever you may come up with. This is all, let's say, inherited by this architecture already. Now, how does it look in let's say, development? Let's just fire up a small dev server for this demo portal that we've seen. Under the hood, I'm using here a tool that comes with the framework. It's called the PyroCLI. For all the bundling and everything that deals with transpilation, it just uses Parcel, which is an awesome bundler. And it's a great tool, a great basis for all the tasks we need. You can, of course, free to choose whatever bundler you want to. And what we can now do, let's maybe first have the look at that, how it looks like. So it's exactly the same thing as we've seen online. Just now in this case on the local host. Now, in the code, we see a part where we actually make the communication with the feed service. And a beautiful thing is that we're actually free to choose whatever feed we want to. Of course, we've chosen here the feed that holds the microfrontends for this demonstration portal, but we could use, for instance, also the feed that uses that we use for our sample, for our primary sample of Pyro. It's called the sample feed. Now let's try that out. And what we can see is, of course, we lost the link, the additional link on top here. We lost also the tiles. Also here, you don't see a link. Now, there are different tiles in there. That's because these microfrontends that we now obtained, they also, of course, register a component that hooks into the dashboard. It's a very common thing, so it just works. Additionally, some of them also come with pages. And now, for instance, I can just play Super Mario. Very nice, right? And it's a nice thing. I mean, it was not developed for this portal, but it just works. It has its own page. It has its own assets. I mean, all these graphics, its own sounds. It just works. And it was a microfrontend not developed now for this portal. And likewise other things, like for instance here we just go against the, I guess, Unsplash API, and also this just works. In the end, the only thing that's necessary for one pilot to work in another application shell is that the shared dependencies are the same. And if you keep that amount very minimal, what you should do, like for instance only React, and of course something like the React router, then it will just work. If, of course, the microfrontend requires some other shared dependencies that only come with some special application shell, then it will break, but it will not break the whole application, but only, of course, that part of the microfrontend that uses that dependency. Okay, so that's a little bit how that goes. Besides this snippet here where you define what's the feed, where the microfrontends are, all the rest is just standard React code. Like for instance, if I want to change the footer, I mean, I just develop a footer component or whatever. The design is completely up to you. All that Pyrel does is care about how to fetch these pilots, these microfrontends, and how to integrate them. So then that brings us to the next step already, which is how are now the development of these microfrontends looking like? Because if the application shell is more or less a standard React application with nothing fancy, then there must be something, let's say, special about these pilots, right? So let's have a look, and let's stop the development server on the portal and start one here on vacation. Let's see. Let's hope if the demo gods are with me. I mean, I prepared at least, so it should work. Okay, cool. So again, we are at localhost 1234, and if you, let's say, made a quick mental pause here, then you wouldn't actually recognize any change. We're on the same application, you would say. The only difference is that instead of, let's say, 2 tiles, we now have 1. So what just happened is I fired up the development mode of a single microfrontend, and it looks like I'm developing in the full application, and that's intentional. Remember that it's the same as with, for instance, iOS. So if you fire up the development mode of your iOS app that you're writing, then also suddenly it looks like you're on your phone, right? It's the emulator of the phone, and that just should give you the shell. But everything you now do, you just do locally. So for instance, let's say I want to change a little bit about this tile here. Let's say I want, instead of days left, I want to say days remaining. Let's just do that. So, and then I will explain a bit how this code here is structured. So let's just say days remaining. And hopefully it works, or it doesn't. Let's see. Maybe I'm stupid. Did I save? Oh, okay, hopefully it was just a hiccup, but we will keep track of that. Okay, so now I have the days remaining, but that's just, again, it's just a development. If I look at the version that's online and let's refresh that, it's still just days left. I didn't publish anything, and I just do a local development now. Now, okay, that may be cool. Days remaining. Maybe there should be some other change. Right now, the data for this vacation planner is just static, right? It doesn't talk to any API. As I said, it's just, let's say, a mock or a dummy to showcase how it could look like. So of course I could do more changes here. But before we do that, let's have a look at how the structure looks like. In a nutshell, a pilot is nothing more than a standard Node.js project like your React applications too. The structure is that instead of spitting out HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, you spit out mostly JavaScript and CSS. So what you produce in the end here is a library. That's it. It exports just one thing, maybe in some other stuff too, but the most important thing to export is a function called setup. And we use that function then in the front end. And this setup is actually the glue between your micro front end and the application shell. So in this setup, you get an object that I called here app, but you can call it whatever you want to. And this has an API. So if we look at it, we see it has lots of functions. You can actually extend that API when you create the app shell. And you can also change the API, whatever you want to do with it. This here is, let's say, a more or less larger set. There's also a minimal set of an API, but let's focus on some of the functions we see here. So what we do is we call register menu, and apparently we call it twice. So once we register a component for a footer link, and once we register a component for the vacation planner. And these seem to be two different menus because we enter here one-time type user and one-time type general. So somehow there must appear two links. Here we see one, and then in links there's another one. This is how the application shell now treats it. I mean, you are free to do whatever you want to do in your application shell. So if I would remove, it's potentially the footer link. Let's see, let's save it. And now the footer link is gone, for instance. Okay, let's bring this back. Let's call it my vacation or something, just that we see later on also some change. And here's my vacation. Okay, so far so good. So we can use these APIs to now pretty much describe how we link components together in our application shell. So what Pyrrol does for you is it not only manages the fetching of the different microfrontends, it also gives you a way to sandbox your different microfrontends and create an API for them. And so essentially, it's a framework for creating a kind of a plugin approach or pluggable front end. So we got some standard things, like for instance, here we register a page, here we register a tile. I write here the React code directly. So this is, let's say, inline specified React components. You don't have to do it for demo purposes. It's nice. But I can, of course, also do something like here, where I say, okay, I have this page and I register it directly. But where's this page coming from? Well, it's just lazy loaded via standard React lazy from some other module called page here. So you can, of course, that's why we use parcel underneath, use any module structure you like, and just do that. For the data, we see this is the mock data. We have a timeout here to simulate a little bit of HTTP delay. Okay, now, of course, so development is pretty standard. I can also include CSS the way I know it. I just reference it and it is there. So if I would change some of the rules here, like for instance, how the background is of my vacation tile, it would also affect the tile. And that's why using Pyrrol or making a microfrontend with Pyrrol feels like creating either a React application just as exposed as a library, or if you would, let's say, create a React component library. It's all pretty similar. In the end, all your Pyrrol related stuff should remain in this one module. So to also wrap up, the last thing, how easily can you now get that online? Let's do the following. I have one script prepared, publish. And Yeah, you can copy the key. I will revoke it in a second. It goes directly to our feed. And what we will do here is we will just publish now our changes. So I think the command is now called publish vacation. Let's hope that this works. It packed something, it uploaded, and now remember the days remaining. Let's refresh. And it's now days remaining in my vacation. So I just published a change, and I didn't need to build the whole portal. All the rest that was just remained untouched. And that's a little bit how the development approach looks like in Pyro, how we imagine a microfrontend solution based on React can look like. So all in all, our goal was here to interfere the least possible amount with a standard development approach and really just introduce the bits and pieces that are useful for developing a distributed application. I hope that there are some questions. If not, then just check out the project on GitHub. Any contributions welcome, and yeah, also any questions welcome. Thanks.
Thanks, Florian. That's pretty cool. So it looks like we don't have any questions right now. Could you tell us a bit, when did you get started with the Microfrontends?
Yeah. So, I mean, as said, we started, let's say, 3.5 years ago with this applying microfrontends. Of course, we didn't, let's say, call it microfrontends back then. That term, as mentioned, just got very popular over the last 1 to 2 years. But we came up with this architecture. We say, I guess we need a special kind of service. So what would be the pros and cons of introducing a service? Otherwise, you'll always end up with either, let's say, modifications in the build system, which is not something we wanted to do because it makes CI/CD really complicated. It also adds a lot of delay. Or some server-side stitching, but we always said we want to do something that in the best case works completely serverless. So for instance, you can just now use our feed service and you can just deploy your application shell on a S3, for instance, or even on your Dropbox public folder, and it will just work. And you can have this nice, beautiful flow where you just develop a new functionality and you publish it. And this kind of architecture we now, let's say with refinements, do for around about 2 years, a little bit more. And with Pyro, we started a year ago with active development. Last year in November, we let's say announced it at the O'Reilly Software Architecture Conference where we had a talk. Yeah, and since then the community is growing. It's good, but of course we are still pretty new, and we would love to get a little bit more attention, a little bit more contributors to get in touch and see different use cases. That would be fairly nice. Yeah.
Okay, and last year there were a lot of pushback from the community who weren't familiar with the concept of microfrontends. Do you? If you wanted to explain to people who are really new to the concept why they shouldn't push back against it, what would you say?
I mean, so in a nutshell, I have nothing against the monolith, right? So if you have an application that should do a single thing, and you're not planning to, let's say, maintain this thing forever, there will not be any new features popping up every week or something. You know, it's pretty narrow what it should do. Why go for the extra complexity? So I think, excuse me. I think all in all, microphones are a nice addition if certain criteria are met. So for instance, one criteria could be distributed teams, right? So you want to allow teams that should not have access to your main code base to still develop new features. Maybe that's let's say a legal thing that they shouldn't have access. Maybe that's let's say you want to have some more boundaries, but maybe it's also just for acceleration purposes, right? They should just focus on this one thing they're implementing. Maybe it's also an autonomy thing. They say, oh, they already, like for instance, you want to create full stack teams. You could say, yeah, awesome, you already created a backend service, you know a little bit of React or frontend, you also now developed the first version of managing this backend service. So all these scenarios are possible. The other spectrum, of course, these days, quite often you hear, oh, we need to do microfrontends because we have Vue and we have React and we have Angular. So we have a mixture of frameworks or technologies. Yes, you can use microphones. You can use Pyro for that too. But we always say the best case is that you only have a single framework, like let's say React, because I mean, it will make a lot of things easier. It is the smallest footprint possible, not only, let's say, from bandwidth point of view, it's also smallest, of course, from browser memory usage. It's also the most optimized in terms of patterns to share, like, for instance, components you want to reuse in a kind of pattern library where you say, oh, I already defined that button, and maybe not just, in CSS, but I went one step further and I have a behavior that I implemented in JavaScript and I used React for that, for instance. So our recommendation is, of course, you can use it for that scenario too, but keep in mind it should never be your aspiration to have as many frameworks as possible in the front end. Coming back to the question, maybe this is not very satisfying for some people. I think when you are at the point to need a microphone, you will know it. Otherwise, just consider it another tool, a tool that can help you to break up a larger monolithic front-end application into smaller pieces. And as explained, there are different reasons, and some of them may be technical, but in our opinion, the business-driven ones are the more important ones, and you will see it when you get these requirements that a micro front-end solution may fit, right? So if you don't feel like I need to do something, then don't do something. Monoliths are perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Florian. I think that's it for questions. If you have any more questions, you can ask in the comments on YouTube or on Twitter. I've posted the link to the Pyro project on YouTube. You can check it out. And if you like the content of this channel, don't hesitate to click the subscribe button. And that's it. Thanks, Florian. And if you have anything else to say, let us know. Or otherwise, see you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.